Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Regulation Navigation brought to you by ITS. This is our webinar series that's centered around regulation-related topics. We cover high-level compliance requirements, and we give an opportunity for you to learn something new or ask questions or validate what you may already know. Hi, I'm Chris Taylor. I'm the ITS Vice President of Learning and Product, and today we're delighted to have Gordon Tipton. Gordon's an industry veteran with experience managing the training program and OQ program at a large multi-state operator, and he is now the current director of the Evaluator and Proctor Services program at ITS. He'll join us to share his experience about becoming an OQ manager and his story of managing a large-scale, multi-year program change, including ways to get more buy-in from everyone involved and how to ensure your programs remain objective while prioritizing integrity. We'll also touch on some of the latest compliance-related news that's popped up over the last quarter in just a minute. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items to ensure this experience is beneficial to everyone. This session is recorded, and recordings are posted within days following this broadcast on our website, its-training.com. As a general reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice and should not be utilized as your only source of information. So please review the disclaimer on the screen before acting on any advice given and seek guidance from legal counsel or other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. We hope to have time at the end of the session where you can anonymously ask questions about the topics we discussed today. Please type those questions into the Q&A feature into Zoom or in the Zoom app. We will address those questions as time permits and respond to you through email if you do leave your contact information. Also, we offer 0.1 CEUs or continuing education units. You may be able to apply to your professional development hours. So in order to qualify, you must attend the entirety of our program today. And after the webinar, we'll send out a feedback form that you can fill out and return to us if you'd like a certificate for those CEU credits. So before we begin our discussion with Gordon, we have a few news items. On the top, PHMSA issued a final rule in January updating pipeline class change requirements. The new final rule just became effective on March 15th, a few days ago. The code change significantly modernizes how operators can address Class 1 and Class 2 to Class 3 location changes. Historically, operators were required to reduce MAOP, pressure test, or replace pipe when a population density increased, and the new rule now codifies an integrity management alternative under 192.611. This allows eligible Class 3 segments to maintain or restore MAOP through enhanced integrity management practices rather than defaulting to replacement or pressure reduction. The rule introduces two new eligibility definitions, including eligible Class 3 segment and eligible Class 3 inspection area, and limits the alternative to segments meeting specific criteria. Eligible segments must be designated as high consequence areas and incorporated into the operator's Subpart O integrity management program with required one-time actions within 24 months and some ongoing assessment. Importantly, the IM alternative may be applied regardless of when the class location occurred. Bottom line, PHMSA seems to be shifting from a rigid population-based policy design only to toward a more open, risk-based integrity management posture. Up next, PHMSA issued a notice of limited enforcement discretion tied to the national energy emergency. This is stemming from a Trump administration executive order. In a letter from the Office of Pipeline Safety Acting Associate Administrator Leonard Doherty, PHMSA states, it will generally refrain from enforcement under 49 CFR parts 190 through 199 and 171 through 180 when a regulated party defers required activities that would otherwise adversely impact energy transportation in the West Coast, Northeast, or Alaska, provided the deferral does not create an unreasonable risk to public safety, property, or the environment. A special permit application must be submitted within 45 days of the decision to defer. Qualifying applications will receive priority review, and enforcement will be deferred while the application is under review and for a reasonable period if denied. The notice does not waive regulations or carry the force of law, but outlines PHMSA's current enforcement approach during the declared national energy emergency. You can see a link in the chat for that letter. An NOPV was issued for a pipeline. PHMSA issued a record $9.6 million proposed civil penalty for a notice of proposed violation and compliance order. This was tied to a major offshore crude oil release of approximately 27,000 barrels in Louisiana state waters. The NOPV alleges multiple probable violations, including pipeline design for external loads, integrity management, risk evaluation and data analysis, leak detection performance, operating and emergency procedures, control room management, controller training, and valve maintenance. You can learn more about that enforcement at the PHMSA website and on the press release that we'll add into the chat. PHMSA has issued a significantly restructured 2026 gas distribution question set, in which the agency completely reorganized its categories, shifting away from a topic-based structure. The new format emphasizes procedures, records, and pipeline field inspection, and includes 168 new questions and 11 revised questions. 161 of those questions are focused on LPG requirements under NFPA 58 and 59. Within gas and distribution integrity management exceptions, PHMSA revised 11 questions, added 7 new ones, and additionally, Section 114 questions, and those refer to the Pipes Act of 2020, requiring certain O&M around hazardous leaks, were removed. And the new structure aligns inspection questions more closely with the field assessment workflows and expands LPG coverage. You can see that form for yourself in the link in the chat. And PHMSA recently issued 3 advisory bulletins affecting pipeline operators. The first warns hazardous liquid pipeline operators about integrity risk tied to Type A repair sleeves. It cites incident data, including a January 2025 fuel release in Pennsylvania. While the advisory does not prohibit their use, it does emphasize proper installation, inspection, monitoring, record keeping, and integrity management. Links to each advisory I cover will be in the chat. And the second advisory reminded gas pipeline, underground natural gas storage, and LNG facility operators of their incident reporting obligations, stemming from an NTSB safety recommendation following a fatal gas distribution incident in February of 2018, excuse me. The third bulletin advised all gas and hazardous liquid pipeline operators to winterize their facilities and increase monitoring of ground movement and external loads in preparation for extreme cold weather events. And finally, our last news item, the minimum random drug testing rate for this calendar year will continue to be at 50% for all covered employees. And the current administration's, being the Trump administration's, recent executive order that reclassified marijuana from a Schedule 1 drug to a Schedule 3 drug, categorizing it as a drug with less potential for harm and dependence. But the Department of Transportation Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy and Compliance issued a notice that marijuana is still a Schedule 1 drug under the Controlled Substances Act, and until any rescheduling is officially complete, it remains unacceptable for any safety-sensitive employee subject to drug testing to use marijuana, and the DOT's drug testing process and regulations have not changed. You can see a link in the chat to that. Now, excited to introduce Gordon Tipton. Like I said, Gordon has a wealth of experience in the OQ space, and happy to have you on, Gordon. Can you give us, in our audience, just a high-level overview of your career in the industry?
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I've been in the natural gas industry for about a total of 30 years, and I spent 18 of those years as a worker in the field. I worked at a large, like you said, I worked at a large multi-state operator. And then after that, I retired from there and worked as a manager at a leading industry contractor for large diameter hot tapping and plugging. And then, of course, now I'm the new director of Evaluator and Proctor services here at ITS.
Fantastic. That's a lot of experience. And in some areas with, different skill sets, I've met many OQ professionals that previously had field experience, and it seems to be a common path, coming from the field and into the OQ professional space. Can you share about the skill sets that carried over from your work in the field compared to the skill sets you developed on your way to becoming a manager?
Yeah, sure, sure. I went from the field, where all my experience in the field, and I went to OQ data entry. So I came directly from the field into that. Then I moved back over to process improvement groups, and then I came back to OQ in 2018. And part of that we were transitioning over. So managers, in my opinion, do need to understand the data and the processes at that point. And there were some of the things that I'd figured out when I was in process improvement. We used a lot of flow charts and diagrams, and we had to show connections with the end user. Then we also had to analyze data and deliver reports to the higher level people within the company, the C level at that point.
So you had that kind of interim step. You didn't go right into OQ management. What would it have been like if you went straight from the field into a management role? Because I bet this happens commonly in the industry, especially at smaller companies.
It would have been overwhelming. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I had to learn things slowly as I gained that experience through it, with processes and procedures. Then I learned more about B31Q as we were bringing that on board. I had to understand the whole OQ process, industry standards, the local regulatory needs, including, local regulators, understanding what they're looking for us to implement.
Yeah, there's a lot to kind of drink from the fire hose, I think, in this space. And when you say B31Q, that's the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, ASME B31Q, for those that may be unfamiliar. It's an industry standard, and we actually covered in depth some of the latest changes to that standard and about that standard in a previous episode of this program. You can find that on YouTube or at our website, its-training.com. We'll drop a link in the chat as well. But we reached out to many experienced OQ managers for this program and provided a survey. Again, they were experienced managers of mature programs, and they offered the following skill sets as some of the most challenging to develop in the role. And and also that these were skill sets that were key to their success and recommended for new managers to hone. So you can see those on screen. And it's evident from the responses that strong management capabilities, regulatory expertise, and data literacy are core to the role. I mean, much what you just talked about, Gordon.
Hmm.
For the people who were thrown into a management position after working in the field, which skills of these do you think they should develop first?
You're right, Chris. It's the understanding the regulations and managing resources. What is required by PHMSA and your company before you start communicating with operations as you're transitioning. You know, since I came from operations, I wanted to understand why I was required to do things a certain way. I understood you need resources, but also I used to push back against implementing B31Q. As a manager on the compliance side, I could see the value of investing time in understanding and gaining more comprehension of B31Q process. I think, operations can usually say that moving over to compliance is kind of like going over to the dark side a little bit.
Yeah, so it's kind of like Luke, I am your OQ father. Okay. I don't think it's that bad being in compliance, right? Like, in all seriousness though, so Gordon, you had a three-state program, and when
Mhm.
you talk about moving over to B31Q, let's get a little more detailed about that. So that was essentially going from, you know, I guess the point was you had less tasks. You're expanding into a more granular task list. Typically, that's what that means to a program. But you also had like three different states to take
Mhm.
into account, and you're probably operating in very different ways. What was the process like? Can you tell us more about that, and what did you learn?
When I look back in retrospect, I think my company was more on the proactive side. We weren't as reactive, weren't any kind of major incidents pending and that kind of stuff. we moved our contractors over early, in 2014, and then we moved our employees over, from the three different state specific programs, which caused, it reduced our portability in having these three state specific programs. The B31Q, and once we moved over to it, increased testing by 5 to 6 times longer.
Yeah, I could imagine again moving from that. So just for our audience sake, it seems that your previous program, you had more compressed, if
Mhm.
you will. You didn't have the granularity and depth that having a B31Q based task list gives, because I mean, there's so many more instead of like a job role based kind of task structure, which some companies still have that very more granular one. Is that the case? Can you tell us more
Yeah,
about that?
yeah, absolutely. Because what that old program was, it was like you were getting the hamburger, but with B31Q, it's the more granularity. It gives you the bun, the meat, the lettuce, and the tomato. We used to test over just that hamburger. An example is we used to have installing a service line was one of our tasks. But with B31Q, we were able to test more adequately on each component, tracer wire, install poly pipe in a ditch, tapping with a built-in cutter, backfilling, etc. So it was a big leap in the amount of time for testing. We knew that was a huge impact on operations. We knew we weren't going to make friends with this, so we had to communicate a lot, about a year ahead of the switch. You know, when we communicated up and down through the organization, the director that I reported to, he went up that chain a lot of times, parallel with himself, his peers, and then I met with a lot of the managers down it. So it took just a dual effort from both of us because we wanted them to know what was coming. We gave them the training also well in advance, and we built out the job roles ahead of time. And then we guided them to only take what made sense. We empowered managers to select the job roles and then help us make decisions on how to roll it out logistically wise.
So out of that, communication is key. I think that you touched on that. It's such an
Mm.
important base skill. In fact, based on a recent survey we conducted, communicating program changes across the organization held the second lowest confidence level among those experienced OQ managers. So we thought it would be a great opportunity if you can get your audience, if you can get your smartphone out real quick, scan that QR code, or in your web browser, you can click the link in chat or type in that pollev.com/ITS training 101 and take this quick poll with us. We're going to run a live poll. So here's the question. For those that are responsible for communicating program changes across the organization or to operations, do you feel that you get adequate acknowledgments back from the field? So what's your feeling on getting adequate acknowledgments back when you communicate across the organization or to operations? Go ahead, and we're getting some responses in there. So we'll let those pile in before we show the results in just a second. Um, you know, Gordon, as we wait for those results, I've always heard that communication is a two-way street. The listening aspect of communication. How does ensuring acknowledgement play out in change management?
Our relationships with operations in the field, it was essential. It was so important. You know, we would break our communication down into department levels, such as measurement regulation, corrosion, line locate, the general construction group, customer service. And so that everyone could have a voice in the meeting. We figured if we had a large group of all different departments, then some of those voices would be lost. And that generated much more ownership. Just asking for information wouldn't cut it. I had to meet face to face with some of the people and explain what was happening and why. You know, and it made a huge difference. You know, they saw the advantages over time. A lot of times we didn't get that warm and fuzzy thank you. It was more of, hey, this makes us much more robust OQ program for the company. And some of those managers were the most proactive to get their teams in for testing. That only happened because I invested in that relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see our results. So,
Mm-hmm. That's
That's kind of what we expected, wasn't it? Not usually.
Yes, that's kind
I,
of why I expected. Yeah, a lot of times, we may made those communications from changes. It was just sometimes getting that feedback from operations. Or sometimes you got crickets, and
yeah.
maybe they got the message, but it was always a challenge.
Hey, so for those of you that always, it's just a 5%, it's only a handful of you, that always get adequate acknowledgments back. Can you take a second and type in the Q&A feature in Zoom and share a little bit about how do you achieve that? And maybe the most of you time people, throw a comment into the Q&A if you don't mind. We'll cover that later. Um, so just to recap about the importance of communication, face-to-face communication builds trust. We've heard that. I think next slide, please. Um, and department level meetings encourage ownership, and strong field relationships improve compliance. And supervisors can become proactive over time when you foster those relationships and you have effective communication. And communication is two-way to be effective. So remember those little things when you think about communication in your tactics in your program. You gave us a great overview, Gordon, of how to make a transition with a team, but what goes into the day to day for your whole organization, not just a team? But what goes into the day to day implementation of an OQ program? What was your biggest challenge in the day to
Our
day?
challenge is that we had to get people into test. I mean, life challenges come up for everyone, right? It was especially hard for our supervisors to get them to come in and qualify, you know, and they're busy. They didn't always have time to qualify, and we had to take into account the differences between a union and the non-union workers we had within our organization. Some companies like ours at the time, we required supervisors to be qualified. And I suppose it really depends on your company, but it's not a one size fits all solution. In the case of our larger operator, we benefited from having our supervisors qualified. It gave us additional qualified resources, plus provided flexibility for emergencies and collective bargaining contingencies. And, our number one problem was getting operations supervisors to complete their qualifications. They're
Really?
out in the field, paperwork,
Sure,
job packets, maybe even putting pipe in the ground.
sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So were these supervisors also evaluators or proctors?
Now, our first objective for requalification was to move OQ testing out of the hands of operations
So it used to
supervisors.
be,
hmm
and then
It,
under you
it
changed it. Okay.
yeah, in one of our states we did have that. One of our divisions we had that. You know, at the end of the day, we still had exceptions. We had two departments such as compressor stations and gas control. Really specific technical groups that uh, even our evaluators just didn't have that expertise. We wanted proctors and evaluators to be kept separate from operations to help, create some objectivity.
Yeah, I was going to ask why, but tell me more about the objectivity.
We saw that the internal evaluations with a supervisor over their employee definitely created a risk. We didn't want
Okay.
supervisors and operations to be put in a position where they had to evaluate the people they oversee and had just trained. You know, an evaluator is only testing your knowledge, skill, and ability without taking into account who the person is. Are they on the same softball team together? Their kids go to school together. It's hard to be objective on a human level. You know, OQ programs, in my mind, need to just test. Just maxing out qualifications isn't our point. You got to get them done, but OQ and training are two different hats, in my opinion. You need to know that difference right off the bat.
Well, that's an important thing good advice for new OQ managers and maybe old OQ managers, more experienced. So we talk about maintaining integrity of an OQ program throughout the industry all the time. It's about maintaining the integrity of an OQ program. But I think what you're hitting on, it's an important to emphasize that we mean the integrity of the program itself. And I mean, do you think it's fair to say that you could have an honest OQ manager or an honest supervisor who's doing
Mm,
evaluations with a lot of personal integrity, but they just might not inherently, they may not be objective when they're
Hmm.
evaluating. And that impacts the program's integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great distinction to make. Of course, you could have someone who is dishonest about their evaluations, but we're focusing mainly on the personal objectivity that preserves the integrity program. And that's inherently that's hard for somebody to make that switch or flip that switch.
It is. Yeah, I think those that do, really you as an OQ manager focus on that. Make sure if that's what your program looks like, make sure you've got, some good controls in place. Make sure that they have training around that, knowing their role, and they switch that hat effectively.
Yeah.
That's such a key element I think folks need to understand about training and testing. That the distinction of the two. When you have supervisors, evaluators, that's inherently a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
How does that impact the integrity of the program? Like, really?
Chris, I used to think of OQ as a checkbox, get it done, right? But as an OQ manager, I could see that conflict of interest. I had to, but the director and I, we had to get those evaluations away from the supervisors. It just created too much risk for us. There were very specific and technical jobs that we had to have supervisors evaluate because of their expertise. However, most of our evaluations were by dedicated evaluators, truly dedicated to that position. It was a transition over time. Some became dedicated trainers and some became dedicated evaluators. So it gave that person the lane to kind of figure out, hey, where am I best fit at? And we also used third party evaluators after considering the costs and challenges of having our own internal evaluators.
That's interesting. And a third party, you may have its own other sets of considerations, but definitely objectivity could be achieved because they don't have the same incentives. In a recent survey we conducted of those OQ managers, two-thirds reported that their evaluators also served as trainers or supervisors. So it's kind of the majority of that sample. But at the same time, they held the highest confidence in the checks and balances that they have in place for evaluators and proctors. Um, you know, do do trainers also face similar conflicts of interest as supervisors do? You touched on this a little, but I mean, let's talk about more.
Yes, no matter how hard trainers try to be objective, they have a conflict of interest. I didn't always see that earlier on in my OQ career, but with OQ, objectivity is so important.
Yeah, it is. Would you describe the approach that you took? Basically, you had kind of a decentralized OQ program where supervisors were qualifying their workforces and they were training. Would you describe it as centralizing your program for objective evaluator and proctors?
Yes, absolutely. It provided much more control over the evaluator process and the objectivity of it at that point.
So that's yeah, I think some things to consider for those that may not, but you may have great controls. I mean, you have high confidence from that sample size. Again, some may be on here, others who weren't on that survey. Where your program is could be different, but question yourself and think, what controls do I have in place? And maybe they're fantastic and work, but just know that there is an inherent, risk of conflict of interest with that kind of a setup. So one item in the confidence poll that stood out, just kind of switch gears a little bit, is resource constraints. It ranked the lowest in confidence across the respondents. But not only that, it was one of the top three biggest challenges that seasoned OQ managers face: resource constraints. How can resource constraints erode, that ideal setup that you were able to achieve, Gordon? How can it erode, having having the resources to have a dedicated evaluations team, or how can it erode objectivity in general? Can you speak on that?
Yes, yeah, in my opinion, this highlights the challenges that many Q leaders face. Operations supervisors may be called on to help with evaluations, but you may not be able to audit them to ensure objectivity because you're just thankful for their help at that point. You know, to me, you need to make it work with the resources you have. It's almost reminds me of being a coach of a baseball team at a small high school. You got what you got to work with.
Yeah. So you made the call to outsource some of your evaluations to a third party. What was that purely from a resourcing standpoint, or was it also from an objectivity kind of goal? And in retrospect, do you think you made the right call to outsource?
Yes, I think we did. I mean, many of the discussions the director and I had about this, we learned a lot from them. They had a lot of experience and helped us avoid, a lot of the mistakes that they'd learned about, regarding the process flow of testing. If you don't have the resources in place, it can work well to get that outside help. Evaluations, they take away from your staff, from your training department, especially. I mean, they taught us a lot about how to set up each location for OQ testing, and basically we just weren't starting from scratch there to, get a lot of those bumps on the head to figure out what was going on.
And, tell me a little bit more about that, when you shifted to having more tasks, to evaluate on, and this is before we're going to go into exams, but when you had more tasks to evaluate on, what did you do to be prepared for those evaluations? I imagine you had to create, many more props or simulations and really train your evaluators. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, we had challenges with test anxiety. I mean, English as a second language. We wanted our curriculum, when we did all that, we wanted our curriculum to be more engaging, and specific to our company procedures. We wanted them, we spent a significant effort customizing our curriculum with ITS. They helped us use company specific images, procedures, best practices. And then as part of that process, we utilized our internal SMEs. As I explained earlier, we met with each functional department and we used the SMEs from each one of those departments to help us really build that out.
Well, thanks for the shameless plug of, we are, for full disclosure, audience, we're now paying Gordon to say that, but in all seriousness, some in the industry, this is a moment. Some in the industry do think that OQ providers with off-the-shelf programs like ITS aren't enough. But what they get wrong is that operators often customize, like you did at the time, customize an OQ program at so many levels. Can you just touch on that? What value did ITS bring to your program when you customized your program to your system's characteristics specifics?
Oh yeah, when I look back, it really brought personalization to our employees. That way they got to see the company specific procedures. That way they didn't have to struggle with generic terms, images, or equipment procedures. It really helped us, especially as we were building out our simulation props too.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine that must have been a process, the simulation props.
Yes, it was absolutely.
The result was your program could then test to your operation specifics, right? You're like the procedures and the equipment that you used, and
Mhm.
how did that really impact the field and in your
Oh,
program?
oh, it helped us a lot. Absolutely. Employees aren't concerned with the CFRs. That
Right.
doesn't really hit with them. It doesn't really make sense to them. Even if they knew on the backside that procedures are based on them, you know, they want to learn the practical company procedures. Whatever company X procedure for line locate, gas control, whatever that is. Getting our SMEs involved in developing the custom training and testing, it helped us ensure that each department had input in it. You know, that gave SMEs more investment in the program. So then in turn, that just made them more supportive of what we were trying to transition to.
That makes sense, making it more relative to the employees in your operations. Totally makes sense because experts say training is most effective when it's practical and it's immediately applicable.
Mhm.
So when adult learners connect with new information to the real challenges that they face in their day to day, there's just an evident payoff in improved performance and then in decision making, after the fact within their role. Before we wrap up, Gordon, do you have anything else to add? I mean, what other subjects?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Chris. Based on what I know now, I see the differences, in the experience that I'm getting now and how other operators are testing, and learn from them, even when we were transitioning, over to the B31Q, how the classroom is set up to make it better for proctors, how to create better simulation props and how challenges that are addressed, how they're coming at those. You're always learning with OQ. There seems like even in the years I've got into it, I'm still learning new stuff. You're learning from other operators and how they put their programs together. You know, we always talk about working toward consistency with OQ programs, right? And contractors, the concern that they always bring up is wanting programs and process to be more consistent. However, operators always have that creativity within their own programs, providing multiple options to address the same problem. So that way we want to be consistent with our standards, but we can develop different ways to solve these problems.
I think you're talking about when you talk about consistency versus needing to be open to change and evolve. It's striking a balance of allowing your program to be innovative, right?
Yeah.
But you've got to ensure the process integrity and the integrity of your program throughout that. Well, thanks, Gordon. Thank you for your sharing some expertise, and you will in just a moment when we open up for some questions and answers. So grateful to have you with us at ITS, and again, thank you for sharing some of your experience. Now it's time to enter questions that you may have in your Q&A feature in Zoom. Did something we spoke about spark an interest, something you want to follow up on? Please enter those now into that Q&A feature. And if we run out of time to answer your question, looking at time, we should have plenty at the moment. So please get those questions in. I've talked about that poll of the many seasoned OQ experts, and we also asked what was their best advice for those who may be new to the OQ management role or the OQ professional space. And they offered the following top 5 takeaways, much of which Gordon spoke about throughout our conversation. So, number 1 is to know the regulations and know your program inside and out. My mentor, Warren Miller, always cautioned against memorizing the regulations. He always said they may change and you can easily misquote them. So know how to access the regulations. Know how to access PHMSA's OQ FAQs. It's on their website. Know and tap into guidance documents such as the American Gas Association's GPTC. That standard is a go-to for OQ professionals that help interpret, code requirements and really go beyond the code. Invaluable resource from that group. And know your OQ covered task list. Who's responsible in the field? Ask yourself who's responsible for what in the field and how your task list compares to your industry peers, to your neighbors geographically or like-sized in the industry. And just remember, you are the one advising leadership of your organizations on their compliance obligations. So you need to know what you're obligated, and you need to know what's actually happening out in the field. Number 2, so get in the field and learn the why. Plays right into that. Keep up what's done in the field to understand the work and be able to explain the why for your program. Learn and and create great relationships with your regulators. Learn from them. Learn from your SMEs, and learn from your industry peers. Attend seminars, industry calls. Be a part. Get hooked in to the industry because, again, an invaluable resource is a phone a friend. Absorb as much as possible so you understand the reasoning behind the rules and you can explain them, and you can also know what's coming down the road. Number 3 is build strong relationships and communicate effectively. So you need to invest in your processes and your people. Prioritize face-to-face communication. Hold department level meetings. Remember that communication must run both ways to be effective. And be transparent about the challenges that you're facing in your role and that your organization is facing. Evaluate, that's number 4, is evaluate with integrity and accountability. Maintain a clear separation between training delivery and OQ testing. This protects the credibility and integrity of your program. And you and your staff may have personal integrity, but that's just not the same as objectivity and in testing and evaluating in the in an OQ program. And number 5, focus on safety and continuous improvement. So while they're certainly an important tool, OQ programs are not just about keeping a checklist. They are not OQ is not a checklist. They protect the workforce. They protect the public. They protect the public's trust in your organization and in the safety of the infrastructure that you work on and support. And so therefore it requires your diligence. It requires regular review and updates, and you should use audits. You should use findings. You should use even crises as opportunities. Always look at that as an opportunity to improve your program and strengthen your safety outcome. Always be reaching for that excellence and how to improve. So thanks for that. Those just some great advice offered by many, many OQ professionals out there that we compiled, and we'll follow up this broadcast with an emailed summary of this list and many of the relevant links that we cited in the news section of the program. Don't forget about the opportunity for getting credit for your professional development hours. Watch out for that feedback form that you can fill out. If you return it to us, you can get a certificate for continuing education units. We mentioned in the program just briefly about being able to customize your OQ program with ITS, and I just want to share a little bit more because it's such a great value add to companies who don't want to start their OQ program from scratch. But maybe you just need to add a few slides to a training, a few questions, or a few evaluation procedure steps, that really makes your an OQ program yours. ITS offers that flexibility and efficiencies with our custom program, and we can eliminate a lot of headaches and service you. We have an extensive track record for customizing OQ programs. Love to talk. Please be in touch. At this time, we're going to take your questions. It looks like we got a few. If we don't get to your question here on air and you did provide your contact information, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually. The first question is, we're working on simulation props. What's been a really successful example you can share, Gordon?
We, especially the multiple props that we had, a lot of it was kind of a team effort. The director and I and some of our trainers would kind of get together and brainstorm on what that would look like. So that way we would have multiple opinions, ideas putting in that. I mean, several of them we used. I remember even using one where for a leak survey, for kind of leak surveying a whole street area. I used an idea from my grandson's play mat where he used to run his little cars over. So it looked like a city street. So we used ideas from what we could see practically, what made sense, what did they need to look at. And what could they actually demonstrate on that prop. So it was kind of a teamwork effort on that to come up with those. I mean, our director really had some brilliant ideas when he came up with those. It still was a lot of teamwork and just kind of coming up with even better ideas.
Gordon, someone asks, do you have any ideas or approaches to get students to attend training and testing when they're scheduled? We know it's required, but it's a challenge, they say.
It
What
is
what are some tips you
100.
had? Yeah.
100%. That was where it was so important that when we had all of our scheduling meetings like in June before we started testing in January. And so we met with those functional departments and let them know ahead because a lot of times they would know their project schedules for the next year. And we understood they had emergencies come up, and I mean, you can't foresee those, right? But we would try to at least schedule around the bigger projects they had planned for the next year, whether it was a large construction, repair, maintenance project. So that way they could, schedule around that and make sure we had enough people. So we met with each functional department and gave them that plenty of time to think through that. And then we checked back with them, later towards November before that date if they started in January. And then we also gave them tips and advice on, have them go through their CBTs earlier before they came in to do their exam. So that reduced some of that time. So, and we also, with those functional departments, kind of, brainstormed on logistics, is it at best at this location. So we got more of their personal buy-in from them at that point instead of just telling them, here's what's going to happen and you're going to have to deal with it.
That's some good advice. Um, Hey, here's a one that's a little off topic, but why not? Any thoughts on ways to cut the cost on tapping and stopping tasks? They mentioned they use a lot of Mueller shell cutters and stoppers when testing and having to drill a new hole every time. Do you have any
Yeah,
advice for that?
some of our tapping tasks, we use thinner wall pipe. It depends on your company. I'm not suggesting that's the way to go. It's just I mean, even some of them use maybe PVC pipe. It's still the same process. It's that way it reduces the wear on your cutter shells, or thinner wall pipe, such as fence pipings and those kinds of things. That's what we utilize. So that way it reduced our cutter shells and pilot bits being worn down. And, it's still the same process, but it's a different type of pipe. It's not your normal schedule of pipe. But as long as they understand the same process, get the same measurements, those things.
Hey, and it actually is on topic. I was thinking of more operations versus evaluations, and yeah, that's some great advice. What are some OQ program items to focus on to prepare for transitions in the industry? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the big thing, I mean, I had to go back to the B31Q. It just really laid a great framework out for us at that point. We didn't have to focus so much on identifying the frequency of covered tasks, the span of controls, the risk, the complexity of the task. It was all laid out for us. I mean, we customized a few tasks that made more sense to us than what B31Q had, but it laid out the great framework for us to kind of follow as a program.
Yeah, and I can just share, damage prevention is definitely a hot topic, generally, and you can from a state regular our last program, watch our last program, go to the website ice-training.com. We covered PHMSA's enforcement priorities, and we interviewed the state regulator, chair of NAPSR, essentially the state regulators association, about those, and they fairly aligned in their priorities of enforcement. So look at what's being enforced and make sure your program's covered. That would probably be something to really focus on. You know, Gordon, someone asked a little bit, wanting a little bit more, when we were talking earlier about the inherent conflict of interest of having trainers or supervisors qualify or evaluate individuals. At what point does it become a conflict of interest? Can you give some examples? Maybe do you have some examples from your past?
Oh, the best ones, and this is kind of why we made that transition to having objective evaluators, is,
Yeah.
you had so many of them. Supervisors had the mindset of getting that pipe in the ground, get the job done. And so the the feedback that we always got before we implemented B31Q is, hey, I can get my guys qualified. We'll get that done and get that out of the way. Well, then that really struck a note with me. It's like, wait a second, that's not the objective here. It's not to get them completely done. It's to make sure that they're testing individuals, not to get them qualified. It's up to the individual to determine whether they're have that true knowledge, skill, and ability, and to demonstrate that. So there was many examples of supervisors saying they can get these OQs knocked out. Well, that's that once I started understanding the true governance of OQ, it made much more sense to, hey, wait a second, we're missing the objective here. So that's why it was so important for us to get it out of the operation supervisor's hands. We couldn't get 100% out of there because some, like I was talking about earlier, compressor stations, some of those really technical ones, but we were working towards that to get it completely out of operation supervisor's hands.
Um, Here's one. So, what recommendations do you have for subcontractors, or I'd even say contractors,
Mm-hmm.
to follow a successful OQ program? I'll just note, like, at the federal government level and state, contractors are not obligated to have OQ programs. They must follow
Mm-hmm.
the operators. Many operators do require contractors to have some kind of OQ program themselves, but can you talk about, you transitioned your contractors first over to your new B31Q based program. I bet
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more that went into that. How were you successful? And you have any tips around managing contractors?
Yeah, that was a little tougher. It was before I came into the OQ and started managing the part of the process. But the way we had done it is we'd communicated to our contractors, said, hey, your guys are going to move from our state specific OQ program, and then you're going to move over to B31Q. So it was a huge transition, I know, at the time. And, ITS was involved in that too, and helping us build a kind of off the shelf program at that point. And then we later customized it more for our employees, and then slowly started transitioning our contractors over to the customized program. But yeah, communication again was the key, letting them know. And a lot of the challenges we learned from moving our contractors over, we tried to not make those same mistakes with moving our employees over. You know, it was
You
easier to
use
kind
them as guinea
of,
pigs, huh?
yeah, sorry to use that. Yeah, exactly. And to be honest with you, correct. Yeah, the guinea pigs. And we sure had a lot of lumps and bumps and mistakes from just saying, hey, you're going to do this and you're going to move over. And yeah, the communication we made was our contractor resource group did a fantastic job, but it still wasn't enough at times. You felt like it probably wasn't enough because, they felt like, hey, this is what we got to do, and this is what the company's wanting us to move over to. So we're going to have to deal with it. And I think one of the good things is we used to make sure they went to third party evaluator companies and took the self qualification away from them at that point. So that way to help them, keep more into the objectivity, the integrity of what we wanted at that point.
Fantastic. How do you feel about training in the field using span of control? And for everyone, span of control is a ratio of qualified to non-qualified individuals, where the qualified individual can direct and observe and intervene in safety. How do you feel about using span of control in training, leveraging that in the field on work teams, or by default, delaying, someone being in the field being productive and sending those new employees over to an official or a specific training? Can you talk about your training, your initial training programs and what you found successful?
Yeah, I mean, especially for our internal employees, the training was essential. Had to have them qualify and be trained on the process of what you want them to do in the field, and to remain under that span of control for a good period of time. You didn't want them to stay under it completely. And for our contractors, we tried to take the same perspective too. We wanted them to stay under that span of control in adequate time, but you still have to be careful because that can be abused easily. The span of control is it's a challenge for all operators. I know certain areas, the Northeast, have gotten more strict on that and how you document it, especially your Midwest to West Coast. It's a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge, that it's not abused and it's intended to be correctly used, keeping the belt loop method, all those things in mind at that point. But yeah, it's just always a challenge. It's constantly there to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about it, and those I've talked to, there's one multi-state operator that I know of that sends employees across state lines, hours and hours away at their, premier cutting edge training facility for weeks.
Yeah.
And talking to some of those trainers, they speak about how the employees feel invested in right from the beginning.
Yes.
And then like that how important that is to their culture. So I mean that's something to think about just in general. It's a huge investment and it's a shift. But then there's also the need to have training programs out in the field. So I think it's a balance, to some degree. It's a really great question. Looks like we have time for one more before I've got a little wrap up. And I do want to say before we asked a couple of those that had the high percentage acknowledgments and what was their advice, and or how did they achieve that? And one said that they held OQ advisory committees that have representation across their operations, and that's how
That's good.
they get feedback. So think about that tactic. Another said they recently implemented an acknowledgement feature in their change management communications process for internal and external contractors. So that's enabled them to have high confidence in having the acknowledgement piece of communication and communicating change. Thanks for sharing that. Last question that we can take, we have time for. What is the best justification for helping leadership of an organization or operator organization understand that third-party evaluators or non-supervisor evaluators, whether they're internal peer evaluators, is the better option? Do you have what's your elevator pitch for a large operator, and is there a cost benefit there as well?
I think the biggest thing when we were talking, the director and I were talking to, upper level VPs, C-level, they're always looking at that dollar amount, right? Oh, boy, this is expensive to move over. That's, that sticker shock that they have up front. But when you start using those words of risk, reducing risk, mitigating risks by using this and robustness of our program that's federally, then those keywords help kind of drive those decisions. OQ is not going to make the company money. I mean, everybody knows that. It's also if you don't have a good program in place, it can sure cost the company money at some point if there's an incident. I mean, that's the first thing that regulators look to. If there's an incident, they go right straight to those OQ records, period. I mean, that's what they go to first. So using those words of risk and reducing risk helps a lot of the VPs understand that sticker shock.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for sharing that. Can we get our link for signing up for our next RegNav in the chat? You guys can click that real easily. Go ahead and sign up now. You get notifications in the invite. I want to touch on real quick, when someone asked about what program items they should focus on, in conversations I've had with many OQ managers, contractor management, we touched on this a little bit, contractor management, contractor qualifications is a big risk in a lot of organizations. So just really, really look at that as well. How are you ensuring, and regulators are looking at contractor qualifications. So how are you looking at that? So we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us. We are tentatively scheduled for June 3rd, 2026. So that's this year. All right. And sign up now with the link in the chat. Gordon, thank you so much for lending your expertise. Thank you all for being here and for creating a safer industry. And See you next time.